Diana, and welcome everybody. It's good to have you here for our second session of our Urban and Heat Resilience Learning Journey. Just to take a quick step back, the whole purpose of this journey, so we're in session 2 out of 5 that we're hosting in 2024, is to really enhance understanding of heat and urban resilience concepts. Also, we want to proactively focus on stimulating creativity in your work now and in the future, and also, of course, to promote collaboration. So, we really encourage folks to put their names, locations, and contact information via the chat, so you could really keep the conversations going bilaterally. Today's session will focus specifically on heat and its connections to urban dynamics. We have two fantastic speakers, very knowledgeable and friends of our Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance initiatives. Firstly, we'll hear from Roop Singh. She is the head of urban and attribution with the Red Cross Climate Center. And her intervention will focus on exploring current research and scientific approaches in the field of heat. Afterwards, we'll have time for some breakout groups, some reflections, some Q&A. And then after that, we'll hear from Sunandan Tiwari, who's the Director for Global Implementation with ICLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. His intervention will focus on really drawing out a public sector perspective and exploring best practices, key trends, and again, these connections between urban and heat resilience. Just before we get started with Roop's intervention, I'd like to highlight 5 key things that we need to know about extreme heat, which are drawn from the IFRC, OCHA's, and the Red Cross Climate Center's Extreme Heat Report, published roughly 2 years ago. So number 1, that heat waves are a major cause of suffering and death. Climate change is making heat waves more dangerous. Heat waves will become deadlier with every further increment of temperature rise associated with climate change. And extreme heat will have cascading impacts, threatening non-human life and undermining the systems that keep people healthy and alive. And lastly, heat waves prey on inequity. Heat waves have severe impacts on all aspects of society, but it's essential to recognize that these impacts are not felt equally across different genders and social groups. In particular, women, especially those who are pregnant, children, infants, the elderly, outdoor workers, and vulnerable communities at large are often disproportionately affected by heat waves. With this introduction, I'd like to pass over to Roop. So please take it away. And thanks again for being here.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Francisco, for the introduction. As Francisco mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about heat waves in cities and specifically the science behind our understanding of heat waves and in particular the linkage between them and climate change. So I'm going to share a couple of slides and we'll get started. So this topic is particularly relevant right now because many of you may have been seeing in the news headlines like these. This summer and the last actually 13 months have been the hottest 13 months on record globally. So it's definitely something, extreme heat is definitely an issue that's happening around the world now and affecting people. And so oftentimes the question comes up, what is the linkage between a particular extreme heat event and climate change? And so one of my roles at the Climate Center and also a new sort of area of research and work is around extreme event attribution. So answering that question of what is the role of climate change in this particular heat wave event. And so I want to share a couple of examples of studies that we've done where we've actually been able to show how climate change links to heat waves and how that changes their frequency and intensity. So earlier this year in March and April, there was a very severe heat wave that happened in the Sahel, in the western part of Africa, affecting a number of countries. And so what we saw is that maximum temperatures across the Sahel reached over 45 degrees Celsius. Minimum temperatures were at 32 degrees Celsius in Burkina Faso, and elevated minimum temperatures matter a lot because oftentimes you want your body to be able to recover in the evenings at night, so you want those temperatures to decrease. But if they don't, that has a huge impact on human health. We saw high temperatures in some parts of Mali over 48 degrees Celsius. And we also saw impacts. So there was a surge in hospital admissions with 102 deaths recorded at a particular hospital in Mali. And over half of those reports of deaths were people over the age of 60. For comparison, the hospital reported that during the previous April, during the entire month of April, there was 106 deaths, and this was only over a 4-day period. So you could clearly see that heat was driving this increase in mortality. And so we asked this question, was it climate change? And we worked together with a group of scientists and looked at a couple of different pieces of evidence. So one of those pieces of evidence was the observations of temperatures historically. And then we also looked at climate models to see, to create essentially two different worlds. One world with climate change and another world where you don't have climate change, where you don't have humans adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And we were able to run those climate models to compare in a world with climate change and a world without, would you get the same kinds of heat waves or a similar kind of event that we saw happen in the Sahel this March and April? And essentially the answer was that it could not have been possible without climate change. You would not have seen this type of event had climate change not added greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in terms of the details, what did we learn? We learned that the 5-day maximum temperature was really unusual. It was a 1 in 200 year event. So essentially an event that you wouldn't expect to happen. You would expect to happen once every 200 years. And we saw that both the models and the observations show that this type of heat wave would not have been possible to occur without global warming of 1.2 degrees, which we have seen so far. And I really like the chart on the right because it helps us to understand kind of the change in frequency. So before we started adding greenhouse gases on the left, you would have never seen this type of event. In today's climate, now that we've already added greenhouse gases and warmed by 1.2 degrees Celsius, it's a 1 in 200 year event. But critically, as we continue to do this, in a future with 2 degrees of warming, which we expect to see if we don't stop adding greenhouse gases, this is going to become a 1 in 20 year event. And you can see the impacts that we already see today. If the frequency were to increase, we would see those types of impacts much more frequently. And then I'm going to share one more example from a different part of the world. This was in also earlier this year in June. An extreme sort of heat event happened in the US, Mexico, and Central America. And again, we asked the same question, was it climate change? And what we saw was really record-breaking temperatures. The highest June temperature ever recorded in Mexico with a temperature of 51.9 degrees Celsius. Very high temperatures in the US and Las Vegas and Death Valley in Phoenix, but also other things combining with it so that compounding nature of the event that Francisco mentioned. There were forest fires in Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and that led to more air pollution, and essentially the combination of heat and air pollution tends to lead to more people with asthma and other lung-related diseases becoming ill. We also saw at least 125 heat-related deaths in Mexico since March, thousands of cases of heat stroke, and also power outages at the same time that we saw this heat wave, which made it harder for people to cope. And so we asked the same question and we came back with a similar answer. We found that climate change was indeed making this particular heat event worse. And specifically, it made the 5-day maximum temperature event about 1.4 degrees hotter and about 35 times more likely. And for nighttime temperatures, 1.6 degrees hotter and about 200 times more likely. And then I have a similar chart at the top of the page showing you that increase in frequency. And what's really interesting is if you look at the turn of the century, the second box, you'll see it's a 1 in 60-year event. But before climate change, say in 1850s, before we started adding greenhouse gases, it would have only been a 1 in 525-year event, so very infrequent. And today, it's a 1 in 15-year event. And then in the future, we can see it becomes a 1 in 4-year event as we continue to warm. So it really does show you some of the implications of the greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere for future heat waves. This is just another way of showing you the same thing, but we can see all the way on the left that before climate change, this type of heat wave event, essentially the types of heat waves we saw in this region range from 32 to like 33.5 degrees. And now as we're adding more and more warming into the atmosphere, we're starting to see the range of temperatures increase, that we're starting to see temperatures going up to 35 degrees Celsius, and then in the future, even above that. So this is all comes together in a global picture. And this is an analysis that we did earlier this year, looking at the 12 months between May 2023 to May 2024, at the number of extreme heat days that were added by climate change. And you can see that around the world, in almost every country of the world, climate change has added extreme heat days. But there are some regions that are particularly vulnerable, especially in the tropics. You'll notice that you're adding a lot more of those extreme heat days. But really, it's happening all around the world. So now that we understand the linkage between climate change and extreme heat, I also wanted to bring in the urban aspect, because of course this webinar is about heat waves in cities. And we know that the future is urban. We know that an additional 2.5 billion approximately people will live in cities by 2050. And most of this increase will be in Africa and Asia, but it's happening all around the world. And this type of growth is going to expose more people, infrastructure, and assets to climate change impacts. Why is this relevant? Because there's something called the urban heat island effect. And when we have cities that are growing, cities tend to basically be hotter. We see higher temperatures in cities, so people who live in cities tend to be more exposed to higher temperatures during heat wave events. And that's because the built environment sort of absorbs more of the heat, the materials in the built environment, and therefore we tend to have these concentrations of hotter temperatures. And in terms of specifically things like building and density size, increased temperatures, energy use by buildings and cars tend to concentrate and increase temperatures, and then heat absorbing materials like tarmac also increase temperatures. And on the other side, if you were to add additional water areas or plants and parks, those could reduce temperatures in urban areas. So climate change in cities, basically, it represents both a risk and an opportunity. There's a huge risk that we'll have rapid unplanned urbanization that's going to increase exposure and people to climate impacts. But then there's also a huge opportunity to reduce that risk, to catalyze transformational adaptation, and to reduce that vulnerability and exposure. And if we look specifically at extreme heat, we know that it's not just a threat. Well, it is a threat to human health. We know that heat waves are deadly, but it's not just human health. It also has impacts on other aspects. So it reduces labor productivity. We know that around the world, and economic impacts. By 2050, heat stress is expected to reduce labor productivity or capacity by 20% in hot months. And it also has a huge impact on infrastructure. Heat waves damage infrastructure, so that includes roads, railways, they melt asphalt, soften pavement. We've seen impacts like railway lines be destroyed. And so it's not just a human health thing, but impacts other aspects of cities as well. And this is just to show you a lot of the other aspects that heat waves can impact. So there's an impact on the environment through, for example, the increased risk to wildfires. And a lot of these things are connected, right? We've already talked about the health impacts, but it also has an impact on livability. Oftentimes, heat waves make people quite uncomfortable. There is research that shows it does increase aggression, for example, and in some cases, violence as well. It has impacts on critical infrastructure. We've mentioned that already. On the economy, sometimes you've seen impacts where heat waves reduce productivity, the canceling of public events, and from the agriculture side, there's oftentimes damage to crops. We saw that a couple years ago where there was a shortage of wheat in the entire world due to the conflict in Ukraine, and India was set to increase its productivity and sort of export wheat, and then it was hit by a huge heat wave, and they actually banned exports as a result of that because they couldn't produce enough to feed people in the country itself. And so you can see how this has these like cascading impacts too globally. And I want to end with this last point that, of course, we know that the challenges are huge associated with extreme heat, but the opportunity space is also big. And this chart is essentially showing us in green places where we can predict extreme heat at the seasonal timescale. In red, places where we have short-term forecasts for extreme heat, and in gray, places where we can predict heat waves on both the seasonal and short-term timescale. And this covers over 5 billion people. So we have a huge opportunity to also warn people of heat waves in advance and take action before some of these impacts start to occur. I'm going to leave it there and pass back to Luciana for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rube, for that amazing presentation. Now we're going to be moving on to breakout rooms. So during your breakout rooms, we're going to give you 7 minutes to discuss these questions, which I'm also going to pop in the chat in a little bit, which is about urban heat islands. Have you observed them in your work? Have you observed any other kind of urban heat impacts? And in what way has climate change altered heat in your city? So we'd love for you to reflect on these questions with your breakout rooms. And then when we come back, we'd have the opportunity to share with each other, as well as any other questions you may have for Rube. So if Georgia could please help us with the breakout rooms and have fun. I'll write the questions down in the chat.
Where I used to work.
Prepared becomes difficult.
Oh, I think.
Oh.
Oh.
Sorry, we're back to the group.
Okay.
You're back.
Hi again, everyone. Hopefully you had some time to quickly chat about the impacts of climate change and heat in your cities. If anyone has any reflections that they'd like to share from their breakout rooms, anything they'd like to ask group at this point. Yes, Darren.
Yeah, hi all. Yeah, we three, one from Dharam, Laura, and Sunandan. We discussed about the case of Nepal, Bangladesh, and India. How heat wave has started even impacting in the city urban area. We discussed even the highest temperature record, that is something the record-breaking temperature received or recorded in New Delhi this year, and the same was recorded in different parts of Nepal, and then the same case we observed in Bangladesh. So looking into the case, like high demand of electricity during the heat wave conditions, people need, people consume more electricity for fan and others cooling, system. So hospitalized cases definitely, increase during the heat wave conditions, though they are not recorded. So we also discussed about the threshold for heat wave. So the thresholds are different to different regions. For example, the threshold for the plain area, like India, Delhi, is different to that of the mountain area of Nepal. So though the heat wave condition is there, but the temperature is temperature record, exceed the limit. Normally in Nepal, the heat wave condition is considered when temperature cross 40 degree in 2 or more days. But in the case of a bit like a mountain area like Kathmandu, when the temperature cross 30 degree in more or in 32 degree, 2 or more days, that is also considered the heat wave. So it depends on the country or regions, but we need to consider the impacts that we discussed. Over. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, thresholds are a very important topic, very interesting topic. Yes, Francisco, if you'd like to add.
So, sorry, not coming in on thresholds. It's a super point. Firstly, thanks for a spectacular presentation, Roop. Really appreciate it. Our team was quite diverse, so we had the Urban Climate Resilience Program from Colombia, a colleague from there. We had a colleague from Practical Action out of the UK. So it really raised the point, firstly, that everybody's at a different stage of understanding heat risks and heat programming, as a broader comment. And then the second point, I don't know, Roop, I really appreciate that you finished with a message of optimism. If I could ask you maybe again in 30 seconds to repeat that point around sort of the percentage and the people that are under the sort of umbrella of predictive heat wave, and that was another point that resonated. So yeah, thanks again. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that there's 5 billion people in the places where we have predictability for heat waves, either short term or over the seasonal timescale, which is huge. I mean, the opportunity for early warning systems and then based on those to take early action is huge. So we just need to capitalize on it.
Perfect. Thank you. Michael, would you like to add anything?
Thank you. Yes. So just briefly summarizing the discussion that we had, and I think we could have gone on for quite a while. We moved back to the room, but our colleague from ICLE was talking about the situation in Turkey, but also from experiences around the world. And clearly there is a lack of a considered effort almost, or a master plan of how cities deal with heat, and it's quite patchy and not necessarily fully thought through. So I guess from an influencing perspective, that's also an opportunity. And at the same time, we really must not forget the most vulnerable, because there's typically, the city is not homogeneous. So there's, people left out. And how do you make sure they're, heard, they're included, and that they also benefit from whatever heat resilience action is taken? Alpha from Senegal was also outlining that there is an increasing concern, definitely in Africa, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, because there's urban growth, there's people migrating, there's a lot of dynamics within the city, and probably also on quite short timescales. And is that something that essentially, the heat resilience approaches that are being taken, can they cope with that dynamics and with that short time frame? So I found that quite relevant and interesting. And if I may, I just wanted to pick up on what Francisco was also emphasizing again, and Roop, what you were saying in terms of the 5 billion people. Can you just clarify, this is not to equal then that, that is the same amount of people covered by an actual early warning system, right? So I think there's probably a step between there are predictions available and there's, essentially tech in that geography that covers these people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the last mile is there and people would actually be able to take action in terms of early warning. Is that correct? It would be great if you could briefly expand on that.
Yes, so that is correct. Essentially, what we know is there's predictability, which is using models, we know that we can predict heat waves in these regions, but that doesn't mean that an early warning system exists. And so that's why I call it the opportunity space, because there is an opportunity for the Met Service in that country to develop an early warning system, and for that communication to occur, for people to set up a plan around what you do based on the warning. And so that's where we have work to do, essentially.
All right. Thank you so much, Roop, for the incredible presentation, and thanks everybody for your comments. We're going to move on now to our second presentation, which is a really great presentation with Francisco and Sunandan. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Francisco now to help us introduce the next section.
Thanks so much, Luciana. So again, we have Sunandan from ICLE. So let's kick it off. We're just having a semi-structured conversation. So thank you, amigo, for joining us and sharing your insights. So the first question that we wanted to invite your thoughts on is what is the public sector perspective, in your opinion, on this urban heat dynamic? What key trends are you sensing, Sunandan?
Well, firstly, thanks, Francisco, for having me here. And I think that the response to that question has been clearly elaborated on also by Roop in her presentation. Just the numbers that she has shown, the kind of impacts that we have seen across different areas. Some of the feedback now that we've received from the breakout rooms, it's increasingly very hard now for public sector and the government at any level to really ignore the impacts that we are seeing on ground. So what we are seeing now is that there are, at an increasing scale, there are like the national governments as well as city governments who are developing heat action plans in terms of how do you then address when you're hit by a heat wave. I have to point out here also that there is always a bit of the discrepancy that we have between having a plan and implementing that plan. So that still does remain, but I think that it is now becoming really part of the narrative, and it's of the common narrative. That makes it very hard for the public sector to ignore this. And just to throw in some numbers as well, and a bit more at the global stage, if some of the research is also showing, some of it that also what Roop touched upon, in terms of one is the environmental impacts. Of course, you're seeing wildfires and so on. That's having on the environment. From an economic perspective, again, Roop touched upon that, but I think there are predictions that by 2050, you're going to, due to heat-related stress, the economic losses at a global scale, and the global GDP is going to be about $2.4 trillion. So you're talking at really huge amounts. I mean, I don't think you can even imagine what these amounts are. But when you consider cities that really as epicenters of economic activities, there is going to be huge impacts if there is this global GDP impact as well. And also in terms of the social side, if you look at, there's the increased migration or the increased urbanization. I think it's study by UNICEF, if I remember correctly, looked at again that by 2050, I just need to correct myself, that the GDP impact is by 2030 and not 2050. Mm-hmm. And the social impact is actually, that they're saying, but the urban poor would be impacted by heat stress. The increase would be by 700%. So there are huge impacts on the environmental, social, and economic side. So the public sector governments are absolutely need to and are gearing up to respond to this.
No, thank you, Sunandan. I'm reflecting that I had the pleasure of attending something that ICLE co-organized, which is the European Urban Resilience Forum earlier this year in Valencia, which is a green capital. And one of the consistent words I heard from city mayors, city official, public works personnel is polycrisis, 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 polycrisis. Social, human, migration, geopolitics, the natural environment. Yeah, can you maybe expand on that a little bit? It sounds as you were highlighting these different trends. Is that what you're sensing as well as cities formulate their agendas? Obviously today we're talking about heat, we're talking about urban spaces, but I just heard a much more layered, interconnected, intercomplex perspective from chief resilient officers, from heat officers where they exist. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
So, I mean, that we need a more holistic and integrated approach to the challenges we face. I don't think that is something new. That's a realization that's really been there for a while now, and we've been talking about it for several years. But I think it's now that you're really experiencing the impacts of not working in an integrated manner, of not really breaking through the silos, of seeing how you are not insulated by just the activities that you do within your own jurisdiction, that something that happens outside your jurisdiction has significant impacts on you, whether it is political or whether it is environmental, whether it's a disaster, that it is going to have an impact on you. So it is where there is a clearer thinking now, and that's something that from a local government perspective that that we've really been pushing for, is that you need to work in a more integrated manner, which means that there needs to be much more dialogue, both at the horizontal level across the different actors, but even vertically. And it's the good thing that we are seeing now is, at least on the vertical space, is that the parties of the national governments are also recognizing that the importance of bringing, sub-regional, provincial governments, city governments into the dialogues for the plans that they are making. I think a big initiative that came out of COP28 was, where they're looking at bringing them in from revising the nationally determined contributions, for example, by 2025. And I think that is at least a big step in the right direction. And I think there is an understanding that the crisis is at a scale and at a complexity where it cannot be handled just at one level. It requires working across levels of government.
No, thank you, Sunandan, for these reflections. Here on the call, I know I see about 31 people, and we have colleagues from different parts of our family. So we have colleagues from the Urban Climate Resilience Program. We have colleagues from the newer Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. We have broader colleagues that are working in the heat space. As I mentioned earlier, some have developed strategies, some are emerging in their urban heat work. Can you comment as to the importance of alignment with city agendas? And I don't know if you have any examples from ICLE or any best practices in terms of how to best align our current or future work with the city's agenda and what you're sensing in this space.
So I think the best way, I mean, I think there are good practices from all around the world that we are seeing increasingly, in which cities are now looking at bringing the heat risk factor into the planning processes. But just two things that I would like to highlight here is the whole point around that your responses are very context specific. I think that we heard also from the feedback in the previous session. And another element would be really the thing around multifunctionality, and that brings us back to dealing with the polycrisis that you're looking at. So what we are seeing in terms of cities now responding to this is, if you take a certain example from, let's say, Medellin in Colombia, where they've developed green corridors across the city. So what this actually helps to do is to channel heat from heat hotspots within the city out from those spots, helps dissipate that. But it also then provides a recreational space for people to go to, which we know has benefits in terms of for just health, mental health, as well as it helps increase biodiversity. So it is looking at these multifunctional solutions. Another example from Cape Town, for example, would be in low-income neighborhoods. They set up what they call spray parks, so they have fountains. And I think the critical element is also that they're setting it up in low-income neighborhoods, where children, teenagers, and all kinds of, and people also with disabilities can access it easily, and just the cooling down, setting up these cooling centers over there. And that has a lot of social benefits as well, which are hugely intangible, while having the whole cooling impact. So you are, by that one solution, you are dealing, and it is also in terms of just the water usage, as we know, is much lower in these kind of spray parks than, say, swimming pools, which lower income communities cannot even access. So you're typically providing accessibility to these kind of cooling centers. And then it's all around also now we're looking at buildings, and for example, there's a lot of, when you talk about heat, there's a lot of talk about setting up cool roofs. If you look at Ahmedabad in India, where they have, as part of their heat action plan, they had this whole cool roof program, in which they were targeting residential buildings of the citizens. They're targeting government and commercial buildings, which they, as per the action plan, made it mandatory that they need to put in mechanisms by which they actually have a cooling element, and they had identified technologies that were relevant for their particular context, and also then putting in cooling measures, roof cooling measures for low-income housing. So I think that's where you are again, that you are being, through those solutions, you're being able to target many other aspects in terms of housing, in terms of power, in terms of water, and so on.
No, thank you for these diverse and rich examples, Sunandan, and certainly we take away the multifunctional and co-benefits perspective. Maybe just to stretch this point a little bit, it probably goes back to the unique context specific, but in terms of, have you noticed overall that there's specific entry points into working with the city offices? I know from a Red Cross perspective, it's often disaster management, and through that, I've heard entry points through water and sanitation works, others through a sectoral perspective, so energy for mitigation, or education, or public health, obviously the heat-health relationship. Is this something that it just depends on the city's agenda, ambitions, personas, or have you more consistently seen that these 2, 3, 4 areas tend to be, in a way, a bit more successful entry points for collaboration? I wonder if you have any comments on this.
So I would say in general, it really go back to my point of view that it is very context specific. So the best way to enter is where there is the greatest interest from the city, and then from there build it outward and say, include the sectors over there. And that's generally been our approach, because unless you're able to align it with the city's agenda, you're not going to have buy-in from them. The second way is also, I think, through a lot through the way IFRC works. When you're working through communities, of having that thing built up from a bottom-up demand. But I think that is where what is very important is to facilitate that kind of interaction and dialogue, say, between communities and cities and provincial governments, cities and national governments, and so on, and taking that up to the global level. Again, to the point of the multi-level action that is really needed. But for that to take place, you really need to have the space for the dialogue around these things. And I think, therefore, creating that space is something that at all of these different scales across these different actors is another point of entry that we really try and use.
Thank you, Sunandan. Really drawing out where there's actual city interest, or where there's momentum, there's drive. Obviously, all of us on this call firmly believe and lead and support bottom-up approaches and being key bridges and facilitating that dialogue that you're drawing out. I have one final question, but also would invite, if someone wants to put an additional question in the chat, or wants to raise their hand, maybe we still have time for 1 or 2 more questions. My final question is, and it's a tough one, Sunandan, what advice would you give to a program that is just beginning their urban heat work? What would you say are the top 1 or 2 considerations? Maybe you go back to some of the earlier points, but again, taking account that for a lot of us on this call, DRR, urban resilience are new topics, specifically urban heat, and maybe that closer link and intersectional perspective with the public sector, maybe new ways of working. What advice would you give?
So I think, given the people on the call and the experience and the hugely rich experience that they already have
for operation. Yeah, please.
I think some of the measures are not necessarily very new. So I think one of the things around heat waves that we always talk about is a multi-agency response, preparedness, and having that multi-agency capacities. But I think just the nuance with heat waves is that very often the impacts are not immediately or not so tangible as, say, in the case of a flood, and the impacts are not always diagnosed correctly, especially also if you're looking at in a health system. When you go there, maybe there's the symptoms of a heat-related illness is not correctly diagnosed, and that also leads to deaths. There is also where people do not know. I see a heat alert, but I may not know how to respond to that as an individual or a household. So though there is the concept of a multi-agency response is not new to people here, I'm sure, but it is just the nature of the risk that is different, and therefore that would be something that I would really say that you need to keep in mind and use that as an opportunity of the work that you're already doing to build greater awareness around heat-related risks, to build capacities and understanding how do you respond to that. And therefore, you need to, again, work across scales and actors, because it requires different actors to take different actions. So for example, the city sends out a heat alert, but the community needs to know what they need to do when they receive such a heat alert. The power utilities need to know that, okay, there is an increased demand that's kind of coming up, and how are we going to be able to deal with that? Water supply also the same. The health system, are they able to diagnose and treat heat-related illnesses? So you need all of these different actors to be able to play their role, to be able to respond to this. So I don't think that is not necessarily true, new. Sorry, from a, say, a flood thing, but it's just, again, the nuance in terms of the impact that heat has, which may not be so direct. And I think to build that. And I think finally, what I would just want to say, a couple of points would be, given the work that you do, which is so locally led, I think at a global level, there is this huge interest now in locally led adaptation measures. It is something that all of you have been doing for a long time. And I think, but now you're seeing interest even in the larger funding opportunities where suddenly, you know, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, everybody is now talking about locally led adaptation, which IFRC itself and Practical Action and a number of the others over here have signed up to the principles of that. So I think that is another huge opportunity there. And finally, a number of agencies here are also engaged in, say, rehabilitation work after events and so on. So when you are undertaking those activities, maybe you just think a little bit about, consider heat as a risk as well. And so when you're building back better, how are you, you know, just build the heat risk factor into it in terms of, say, building material, if it is a construction work, or ventilation for that matter.
So Nandan, really appreciate again your time and these insights that are again coming from different directions and, like you said, different scales. I think we still have maybe a minute or two. Any burning questions? Would anybody like to raise their hand and ask one final question? And after this, we'll have a chance again to go into breakout groups and have further reflections. But let's see the chat. Senor Jeff Woods, yeah, Jeff, please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Francesco. Sunanan, exactly what you just said, right? The whole idea of building smart, building for the future, not building for today or yesterday. The other side of that coin, though, is also, how I put it, slum upgrading. So how have the most vulnerable in many cities, including Nairobi, where I live, the most vulnerable live in slums where, you know, the construction materials are basically heat sinks. Any experience or ideas around how best to help mitigate the heat in those areas, either through upgrades in construction or other ideas? Over.
Definitely. I mean, that's a great question, Jeff, and that is definitely a huge challenge. And I think that really speaks to the need for having this alignment with the city agendas and, you know, in terms of what they are trying to do, and having that dialogue so that you're influencing the way, such in this case, for example, local housing or for low-income housing programs are actually developed. So I do not actually have any direct example that comes to mind at the moment where this has been successfully done, but I know that there has been trials. I don't remember off the top of my head right now, Jeff, but yes, that is definitely a challenge.
Thanks, Jeff, for coming in. So with this, again, we extend a huge thanks to Nandan for these various insights and for taking the time to join us on this interview. Luciana, I'll pass it over to you for next steps in the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you, Francisco. Thank you so much, Sanandan, as well, for that incredible discussion and all of the key insights and wisdom. Now we're going to go into another breakout room where you have the opportunity to reflect on the discussion, anything you like to add to it, and here are some suggested questions for you. So what kind of key takeaways do you think you can bring into your work or community? How can we turn these ideas into action? And how can we spread these lessons and share them more widely? So now you're going to have same 7 minutes in your breakout rooms to discuss, and then we can come back and reflect. And if you have any other questions for Sanandan at that point, we can also see them. So now we can go into our breakout rooms. Thanks, everyone.
Hacer eso.
Oh.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm gonna I hope you had enough time to chat in your breakout rooms. And I'm going to pass it really quickly on to Francisco to give us some closing remarks and some goodbyes.
Yeah, no, it's just it sounds like a very lengthy speech. No, thank you, Dharam, for the wonderful conversation. Firstly, and thank you all for attending. And unfortunately, I didn't even introduce myself in the beginning. We're so excited to. Dharam's like, who are you from? I'm from the IFRC. I'm our global lead with Zurich Initiative. So we're working across the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, the Urban Climate Resilience Program, and the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. So the IFRC, in partnership with the Red Cross Climate Center, as well as my fellow co-leads in the urban and heat theme, so Michael Zoni from the Zurich Foundation and Karen McClune from ISET, are working collectively to organize these learning journeys. Again, apologize, this is coming in the middle of a learning journey. We're just excited to get to Roop and Sunandan. I just have to jump off and just want to thank everybody for attending and for the continuity. Again, want to reiterate, we have 5 sessions for the learning journey. This was session 2. So Luciana and Georgia, thanks for your help. Will lead us through an exercise to help us select sessions 3, 4, and 5. And again, the recording of the presentations and the materials will be shared. And I can't stress enough, in this space, we only have an hour and a half. And as we discussed at the beginning of this session, it's really about fostering the connections. So as you go into those small groups, please be sure to follow up with each other, share and exchange emails so you could keep going with the conversations and really foster that network. Huge thanks, Luciana and Georgia, for all your work with this, and speak soon. Cheers.